Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to our Turner Med Talks focused on resilience in healthcare construction. My name is Monica Serrano, and I am Turner's Resiliency Program Manager. We have gathered a fantastic group of leaders on the topic today that I'll shortly introduce. But first, let's define resilience. This is how we define resilience at Turner. Resilience is all about embracing change, understanding that extreme weather events and other disruptions are part of our day-to-day, and we must be prepared and ready for them. At Turner, 2 years ago, we made resilience one of our focus points within the sustainability program. And since then, we have developed an array of services for both our clients and their buildings, as well as our internal operations. Along with our Turner Engineering Group, we are capable of producing energy models, resilience analysis of a building or specific resilient features, and we also partner with climate risk analytic companies. Internally, we focus on the safety, well-being, and capacity of our workforce to adapt and recover from disruptions as quickly and as safely as possible. We also focus on the resiliency of our operations, our job sites, our supply chain, and we analyze potential disruptions and have developed plans to prepare, mitigate, and recover from specific disruptions. When it comes to the buildings we build, we believe it's wise to analyze where the building is located, what the hazards and risks are, the use of the building, and the amount of risk the client and the building occupants can withstand. We believe it's essential to look at future climate estimates along with historical climate trends. We can no longer build based on only looking at the past. We have to build for future climate and conditions. This is the agenda for today. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so I remind you all to type your questions on the Q&A option and we'll address them after the presentations. Let me introduce the speakers. Randy Kaiser, as a National Healthcare Director at Turner, is involved in all of Turner Construction's major healthcare projects in North America. This encompasses over 250 projects and $3.5 billion in an annual basis. Randy's entire 40-year career at Turner has been dedicated to hospital construction. His leadership skills and ability to develop strong team relationships have helped Turner maintain the status of the #1 healthcare construction manager in the U.S. for 21 of the past 24 years. Robin Gunther is a principal of Perkins & Will and senior advisor for Healthcare Without Harm. She works at the intersection of sustainability, resilience, and health policy while continuing to design healthcare in New York and beyond. Amy Daly provides leadership to enable FM Global worldwide client retention and growth in the healthcare and education sectors. Amy has been with FM Global for 11 years and spent the previous 19 years as a property and casualty reinsurance underwriter, broker and commercial underwriter, as well as a loss control specialist. I will now turn it to Randy, who will talk to us about resiliency in healthcare construction.
4 times more number of billion-dollar disasters. And keep in mind that this is all adjusted for today's dollars. So the chart in the middle is equally as dramatic in the fact that if you just take the dollar amount of those, not the number, but the dollar amount that's associated with the disasters in the U.S. by decade, again, adjusted for today's dollars, it's more like 6 times more from the 1980s to the 2010s. And unfortunately, if you take a look at associated, the far right-hand corner, associated fatalities, even though we have a lot of alert early warning devices. We have our cell phones now. I started working at Turner in 1981. We certainly didn't have the type of warning systems and cell phones and those sort of things available to us. Even though we have a lot of warning, the associated fatalities are almost doubled from that cumulative 10-year, decade by decade over the years. So go to the next slide. The things when I think of disasters is the hurricanes that hit Texas, the hurricanes that hit Florida, the wildfires that are on the coast of California, the seismic on coastal areas in California. I don't really think of disasters, of climate disasters that are in where I live, Nashville, Tennessee. I mean, I'm not ready to get in my pickup truck and run out and buy hurricane shutters for my house just yet. But what's interesting is if you take a look at the disasters that happened in 2020, these are climate disasters that happened in 2020. The vast majority of them are not coastal. They're spread out throughout the United States. So it's not something we shouldn't worry about just because we don't live in Florida. It is a real concern for virtually everybody in the United States. So with that in mind, I wanted to tell you just a couple of my personal experience before we go on to a more national view. Living in Nashville, Tennessee, we've had 2 1,000-year floods in the last 11 years. So the most recent was within the last month in Waverly, Tennessee. That's just west of Nashville, or the one 11 years ago in Nashville, Tennessee, where on a Saturday, we set the record for most rain in a 24-hour period. The next day, we broke that record. So we had over 20 inches of rain in parts of Nashville in a 48-hour period. And some of the things that we've learned of the 5 hospitals that we work in and around Nashville, Tennessee, I'll get a little granular here, but certainly we'll talk big picture. But I want everybody to walk away with some thoughts that you may have not been thinking about when it relates to floods. The biggest issue that we had and the hospitals had in Tennessee was they're a storm and sewer combo that when the streets flooded, it was coming backward through the lower level drains. So I think if we had the forethought to think about putting drain plugs in when we have weather events, I don't think it's feasible to have a backflow for winter in a storm or in a floor drain, but putting a plug in a floor drain during the weather events would have helped tremendously. Now, I think also the water was coming in so fast, it was over in the basement levels of the hospitals. It was going much faster than the sump pumps could pump back out. In one instance in hospital, the entire floor, or the bottom floor, which was a parking garage, was completely full up to the ceiling, and the cars were completely submerged. So I think just for $10,000, $20,000, you can invest. Marco, don't hold me on that quote, but we can invest in some bigger, oversized pumps that are running off emergency power. I think one instance, people were concerned about somebody getting electrocuted, so we shut off all the power to the basement, which then shut off the power to the sump pump, which then contributed to the challenge. So making the sump pumps waterproof, so if they were submerged, they would keep on working. And in one instance, there's a hospital we work in where they're pumping the water out and then out the building on the second floor. So if the water is 6 or 8 foot deep, you're not going to get anywhere just pumping it into other water. So I think the last topic I wanted you to think about is potable water. Everybody thinks about emergency generators when they think about floods and making sure you got power to the hospital. But at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, that includes also the campus, they go through on peak times as much as 1,000 gallons a minute of water. Now, it's not the medical center, it's the entire campus inclusive of the medical center. And a lot of that is evaporation from cooling towers. But if you can envision the water being shut off to your hospital and you're going through, so say 500 gallons a minute, that could be pretty drastic. And you obviously can't do surgery and fluids don't flush and hand wash things, all that sort of stuff. And so in Nashville, what happened was the water was coming over the banks of the river and flooding out the water treatment plants so that they couldn't continue to deliver water onto the hospitals. Luckily for us, the state of Tennessee is the volunteer state, and the local sheriff department volunteered the prisoners to go out and fill up sandbags and put around, and we never did have our water shut off. But Vanderbilt did does have a contract with a dairy farmer that supplies a sterilized tanker truck that can help with a secondary, or in Vanderbilt's case would be the third choice. You get water coming two different directions onto the campus. So anyway, just some thoughts of the very myopic things you might want to think about when you're looking at preparing for floods. And let's talk a little bit more about the bigger picture. A lot of those things that I've discussed are being thought of throughout the hospitals that we build, from MSK to NYU Kimball. NYU Kimball has an interesting flood wall that floats out of the sidewalk as flood waters rise. So Oklahoma University Medical Center, most all of our hospitals are doing some sort of things such as, it's not necessarily weather or floods. I mean, we're talking a lot today about weather and floods, but obviously you have cybersecurity, pandemic, fire concerns. I'm on the FGI guidelines, and there's a lot of discussion about having a 50-yard vegetation-free circle around the hospital so that if a fire comes, it doesn't go all the way up close to the hospital. But specific to floods, a lot of the things we're doing, we see hospitals do, is redundancy of water sources, building the hospitals for 165 mile an hour wind load, as much as 165 mile wind load, which is an F3 tornado, by the way. 96-hour emergency power that can run your heating and cooling. CMS came out with that bulletin, 4 years ago or so, that requests that your emergency generators also run your heating and cooling in your hospital. And I think something that's interesting, I had two separate hospitals call a month ago to try to have us help them get emergency generators down to New Orleans. And part of the issues are being able to get a tanker truck in there to fill the tank back up after that first, 72 or 96 hour time frame. And there's a lot of thought goes into the elevation of the tank that you can get, your fuel tank, that you can fill it up, and that water doesn't get into that fuel tank. And other things such as elevating the mechanic room out of the basement, a 500-year floodplain for the building itself, instead of, back in more recent past, it was a lot of hospitals just designed to a 100-year floodplain. There's a lot of people now that are designing hospitals in a 500-year floodplain. So if you take a look at, it's been in the news recently, and Modern Healthcare in the last 5 weeks had 2 articles with the same things that I just mentioned. That one article is New York Presbyterian, NYP, has 75 hardening projects underway currently, which is tremendous. But there's a lot of information that's out there that can help the designers and owners that are on this call. If you go to the next slide, that information, I think a good amount of information is in FEMA bulletins, and in particular the FEMA 577. Now it's kind of outdated, but even though it's outdated, it's still pretty good. And it talks about raising the equipment up out of the basement, and just it just seems like it's a very, very good idea just to get your emergency generator. I know it's a nice place to put all that equipment is in the basement, but certainly people are now looking at second, third floor for their major equipment. A lot of different other things besides that in that. So what we thought we would do is to ask our clients questions about what they are seeing, so that we can just present it here today. So I want to go through those questions real quick and show you what the results are. So the first question we ask in our nationwide survey is, has your organization witnessed a property loss within last 3 years as a result of extreme weather? Pretty significant percent, over 50% said yes, you have. So certainly a huge topic. The same thing with, has your insurance carrier notified that you will be seeing a premium? 41% said yes. The next question was, do you plan to invest in resilience measures? the answer from the survey was yes. 47% of the survey respondents said they are going to start spending more money on resiliency. So ask the question, so if you're going to invest in resiliency, what are the top three factors that are driving your organization to invest in that? And obviously, they're pretty obvious answers, I guess, that they want to be able to keep an operation. So that was by far 81% of the respondents had that as in the top three. And then the other question was, what resilient features have you mandated to implement by your insurance company? And a lot of that, or I mean, there's a lot of new codes out there that discusses having to have water redundancy, power redundancy. Those are just common sense things, but it certainly points out how important water is to each and everybody's hospital. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about. So what building resilience strategies do you believe deliver the highest return on the investment? 100% had power redundancy as one of the top three. And then fortified envelope. And I think that's what a lot of people are talking about now, is looking at, and insurance companies are looking at trying to fortify that envelope. So I think that's, from my point of view, what we've been seeing, what we haven't seen. Robin, why don't you talk a little bit about what the design world is seeing?
Certainly, and thank you, Randy. Thanks, everyone, for the invitation to be here. And I want to start by reminding everyone that in 2005, Katrina was the first large-scale healthcare infrastructure disaster failure that was captured in social media. And so the images that emerged from New Orleans post-Katrina of the hospital failures were profoundly disturbing to the industry. If we then fast forward 7 years, almost the exact same set of images played out after Sandy ravaged New York City, NYU Langone, and basically the Northeast coast. And I think that the idea that those images were global, that everyone saw them, and I think the fact that the hospital failures were so profound led everyone to say this is the new era in healthcare. And so in 2015, if you go to the next slide, Monica, 2015, the Lancet produced this report. The Lancet is one of the most respected medical journals in the world. And they did this special issue. They convened a panel on health and climate change. And this was in their summary, that climate change was now a potentially catastrophic risk to human health. And they went on to say that it had the potential to undo 50 years of global public health gains. So what were they talking about? And what is the impact? What are the risks, and how does it impact healthcare? This slide by Force 27 Climate Solutions is the best one I've ever found. So basically, you're either getting precipitation or temperature changes. That results in a whole set of natural weather events that are extreme, the gray in the middle of this slide. And that in turn impacts the operation of hospitals in the light blue bar, and consequently the delivery of healthcare at a time when populations need it the most. Next. And so we have to really get to this question of, is our healthcare infrastructure resilient to these extreme weather challenges? And certainly, here's a compilation of images drawn from those disasters that would suggest that it's really not yet there. Next. So Tom Fisher, who's the dean at the University of Minnesota School of Architecture, wrote this book, Designing to Avoid Disasters. That's that Minneapolis bridge failure on the cover of his book. But it's interesting that he has this sentence in the book. where he actually defines something he calls fracture critical infrastructure. And he uses hospitals as an example of that, power grids to hospitals. So we get lumped in with utilities. And these hospitals are vulnerable to the failure of a single element in this weather. And the issue is, next, Monica, that the emergency management infrastructure of hospitals has been focused over here in high probability, low to high impact events on hospitals. But the climate risks, the extreme weather, falls in a different category. Next. It falls in the world of low probability, but high impact, as shown here. And that's why it's been challenging in a way for emergency management people to get their heads around this risk. Next. So in 2014, I had the pleasure to work with John Belvis, who's now leading a new initiative in the Biden administration and the Department of Health and Human Services to do a healthcare resilience toolkit for hospitals. And this is a screenshot of the website where the report and then the toolkit itself, which is a set of checklists, resides. And what's interesting about this is that when we undertook this in 2014, there was almost no national look at what the root cause of these infrastructure failures were. Because I think, as Randy said, everybody thinks that if you're on the coast, you care about coastal stuff, but you don't care about other things. And people inland think people on the coast have nothing to teach them. So we did a national look, and this is what we found. Next. We found there's basically 4 things that happen. One is, the first 2 are about intensity and duration. You're either getting weather that exceeds design thresholds, winds that blow out windows, hail that wrecks roofs, or you're getting or rainfall, as Randy mentioned, that just is way more than anybody has in intensity. The next problem is that recovering is taking longer. The third thing is that the weather is migrating. So you're getting the idea that this weather, like with Sandy, these events are happening in places that have never experienced them. And then the last thing you're getting is it's taking utilities longer to recover from these events, just like it's taking everyone longer to recover. And consequently, hospitals are islanding more. Their need for reliable power has basically outstripped the utilities' ability to provide it. So the Lancet had a solution, and that's the second paragraph on this slide. Let's move to low carbon health care so that we can become more resilient to the impacts of climate change, save money, and lead by example. Because quite frankly, society isn't moving fast enough on the resilience front. So that translates into these 3 pillars that Healthcare Without Harm uses when they work with hospitals on energy, climate, etc. The first is to reduce impacts, to mitigate. The second is to improve the resilience or adapt your infrastructure to the new normal. And the third is to support the public policy and the people who are also working in this space to improve the public understanding of climate and health risks. Next. So you can see the mitigation work that's happening all over the country, whether you're talking about Mass General Brigham, formerly known as Partners, the Cleveland Clinic, next, or this Safety Net Hospital, Boston Medical Center in downtown Boston. They actually did a partnership with MIT and some other Boston entities to buy a solar farm in North Carolina in order to offset their electricity use. Next. And then Kaiser Permanente last year announced that they were the first carbon neutral health system in the United States. So you can see here in the photo that they've been putting solar panels on parking lots, on buildings. They've also made a massive investment in a concentrating solar field in the desert Southwest. But basically, systems are moving on the mitigation front. And the way that improves resilience is that if you use less energy, you can run longer on a fixed supply of energy. Next. If we go back to 2001 and look at what happened to the Texas Medical Center, which was kind of before the age of social media, there was a massive flood from Allison that really crippled the medical center. It did not cause an evacuation, but had it done that, it would have been the largest evacuation ever undertaken in the history of medicine. So they had already installed submarine doors in their sub-basements to protect, because all their basements are interconnected. They had installed all this infrastructure, but it was 30 years ago and no one remembered it was there. So that's actually the problem with 1,000-year events, is that you can harden, but then how do you know that people will even know how to deploy all that in 50 years? Next. They also undertook a massive transformation of the Texas Medical Center itself. They worked with, I think SOM did this master plan, and it was to really green the campus to give the water somewhere to go in extreme rainfall events. The Houston event, by the way, Allison, was 40 inches of rain, Randy, in 24 hours. So it's just massive amounts of rainfall that you can't imagine. They also partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers and the city of Houston to look upstream at the Bray Bayou, which runs by the Texas Medical Center, and to do a lot of wetlands reinforcement and protection from development so that the river could better absorb the shock of the flooding. Next. What it resulted in is a Texas Medical Center campus that is far more human. It's got more shade trees. It's got more green space. And the other thing they did, of course, was to elevate all the utilities. So a lot of the bridges you see across these streets are carrying more than people. They're carrying the cogen, steam and chilled water, and they're carrying the infrastructure. But if you look at the floods that have happened in 2017, 2018, 2019 in Houston, the Texas Medical Center has largely come through without anything like the level of damage that they saw in 2001. So their testimony that you can do it. If we look at Kiowa in Greensburg, Kansas, Greensburg was destroyed by an EF5 tornado in 2008. They decided to build back the town sustainably, and they have a critical access hospital, Kiowa Memorial, that built back, and instead of hardening, they invested the money in renewable energy. So they now run on wind. The entire town of Greensburg runs on wind. And they also, of course, worked on water sources, Randy, and water reuse. Next. And then I want to move to Boston, where we worked with partners to replace the Spalding Rehab Hospital on the Boston waterfront. They were in the bottom left on the slide. They were moving to the circle in the upper right. While the building was in design, Katrina happened. And as a result, next, partners sort of looked at those images coming out of Katrina and said, not for us. We don't want to be in this social media nightmare. And so they actually did a whole series of moves on the Spalding Hospital, which was the first building of any type on the Boston waterfront to do all this. Next. And they did it all for 1/4% or 1/2 of 1% of the total building cost. So that means they did cogen, they put it on the roof, they did electrical rooms on the roof, they didn't do anything in the basement, they elevated the building, they did operable windows, and so that they could essentially shelter in place the rehab patients if they lost all the power and the HVAC. They took it seriously. Next. And then this is Christus Spohn. If we move to the Texas Gulf Coast, this just recently opened. One of the interesting things about Christus Spohn, next, is that it actually used the RELY system, resilience tool, which goes with LEED and is administered by the Green Building Certification Institute. They use that tool to guide their resilience investments. Next. And then the last one, I'm going to give a water example. This is our project at Lucypacker Children's Hospital, where I just want you to see the lushness of the garden, and then go to the next slide. And that is actually fed by 5 cisterns that total 110,000 gallons that are under the entry drive. And those cisterns collect rainwater, condensate, and the RO water off the dialysis system in the hospital in order to irrigate the landscape year round. The anticipated savings is in the range of 800 to 900,000 gallons of water a year, and no potable water for irrigation. Next. So most of this work, this really leading edge work in resilience and sustainability, is being done by the systems that are on this slide that form the Healthcare Climate Council under Healthcare Without Harm. You can see they represent systems of different sizes all over the country. Next. And I'm going to end with these questions or turn it over to Amy with these questions by saying, how do you measure the probability of failure? What's the cost? How do you estimate the cost of resilience strategies the way Spalding did? And then there's all the intangibles that we all saw writ large in Sandy: research interruptions, loss of reputation, or the economic cohesion in a community from a major healthcare failure. We all know that after Katrina, the economic recovery of New Orleans lagged because of the damage to healthcare. Next. And so Healthcare Without Harm worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers to produce this report, which I encourage you to download and take a look at, the hospital people, called Safe Haven in the Storm. And I'm not going to go into that here because it would be a whole other talk, but just take a look. Next. It actually looks at the business case for being, what happens if an event strikes and you're unprepared versus prepared. And it's a significant difference. And so I encourage you to use that resource as much as you can. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amy to take us home.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Before I begin, we're going to play a video from FM Global's largest single loss in our history. And unfortunately, it was a hospital.
National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for western Jasper County until 6 p.m.
Large tornado on the ground, doing massive damage. It's a maxi wedge on the ground. It's tearing up the entire city on the south side of Joplin right now. It's a massive tornado doing massive destruction.
Damage around 20th and Main. We've got whole buildings missing, multiple subjects injured.
I know St. John's was hit in that area where my folks live was hit real hard right there by St. John's. I'm heading that direction.
All stations fire west. Be advised St. John's was hit in the storm.
Living in the Midwest, being hit could mean a number of things. I really expected just to have part of our building impacted, maybe the roof a little bit. The operator was a little hysterical, said that we'd been hit, get out here as quick as I could, and lost connection. Really hard to navigate because there were no landmarks, and parking a little bit down a hill from the hospital, I couldn't see the hospital till I reached the crest of the hill. So running through 8 blocks, not really knowing what street you're on, trying to avoid power lines, Everything was flattened. What went through my mind was Armageddon. And then when I finally see the hospital, it was still standing, but nothing around it was. It was incredible.
Well, it was something that you just aren't prepared for. Destruction of that magnitude, you know, we often prepare in our drills. We're often thinking what could happen, and never had we prepared for something so devastating.
My first thoughts were, I hope we have survivors, because it really didn't appear that we would. We had no chaos, which sounds amazing, but we didn't. We were very well organized. We were able to get the patients out first.
I had never seen a building that was so open to the elements. I mean, it was completely open. You could see drapes coming out of the building. You could see shattered glass for hundreds of feet. I was really stunned by how many buildings just didn't exist anymore.
So thank you for including me today and including FM Global. Today, I'm going to focus on what we look at from an insurance company standpoint as a good risk and how we partner with our healthcare clients. And I'm going to kind of bucket into these three areas, really knowing your risk, managing those risks with proactive solutions, and then making a commitment to be resilient. We know this takes a really strong focus throughout your entire organization to create resilience for your patients, your staff, and for the community. And coming from an insurance company perspective, resiliency means much more than just having insurance coverage. It means protecting your large campuses and partnering together to take that proactive approach. So as I begin here, I'll tell you a little bit more about FM Global and how we partner with many healthcare organizations around the world. FM Global is an insurance company, so we cover your property, your equipment, any business interruption losses that you may suffer. We provide that insurance coverage, but we're also very different than other companies in that we visit every single location that we insure. We assess the risk that that location may face, and we provide recommendations and solutions to mitigate that risk. And for more than 200 years, Monica, can you switch to the next slide, please? Thank you. For more than 200 years, we've been living by the philosophy that most losses can be prevented and that being resilient is a choice that you can make. So we partner with like-minded healthcare clients who share that same mindset toward property risk mitigation. And the best partnerships that we have are when that overall philosophy about mitigation and being focused on resilience comes together. We recently just partnered with a new client that I love what they said. They said, we want to protect our assets today and tomorrow, but we want to protect them for 100 years from now. And that's when we have the most successful relationships in keeping everybody up and running and operating. As Randy said, most of you have been through an extreme weather event. You do not want to have to evacuate buildings. You want to keep the patients safe, so we can all work together to do that. Bottom line, our goal is to ensure that any loss that a healthcare organization may face would be a minor disruption, not a major disaster. So next slide, please. I usually thank folks at the end of a presentation for listening, but today I want to thank you all up front. Your organizations, protect all of us every single day, and especially for all the enormous work that you've done over the past 2 years during the pandemic. We at FM Global feel really privileged to be able to partner with many of you to help harden your facilities, keep the patients safe, keep the employees employed, and being part of something that's helping everybody all around us. At FM Global, healthcare is the third largest sector that we insure. We partner with nearly 400 healthcare institutions around the world. We insure more than 50% of the largest U.S. healthcare systems. And we have a team here that focuses on the risks that you face to make sure that our insurance coverage and our mitigation solutions are tailored for you. As Randy said earlier, most of you worry about that disruption and access for patients. So in helping to harden the facilities and working proactively, we can reduce the impact of those losses together. And we do know that property loss prevention and life safety are interconnected, because if you create safe and protected buildings, you're ultimately providing a safe and well-protected environment for the people. So this first section I want to cover is just knowing your risk. You know, many folks in the insurance industry think of hospitals as being like a soft occupancy, not high hazard like a chemical plant. Well, I beg to differ. I feel that the size of healthcare organizations and the many different exposures under one roof is a lot to manage. You have the healthcare side, the office buildings, the food service, the habitational, the labs, the power gen, other gases, an enormous amount of water flow. You really have every single exposure under the sun, and it's a lot to manage. The sheer size of hospitals make it a lot to stay on top of. And not all healthcare organizations are alike. Everyone has their own individual risk. Maybe you're located in a river. Maybe you're located in a hail zone. You really need to closely evaluate your own individual risk, stay on top of it as it changes over time. So your goal is to uncover the vulnerabilities before an event ever happens. Next slide, please. This is a graph of the top 10 loss drivers that we've seen over the past 10 years. On the left side, you'll see the severity or the cost of events. And on the right side, you'll see the frequency of events, the number of events. Overall, our healthcare book of business over the past 10 years has really not been profitable. We've had large floods, wildfires, tornadoes, many water damage claims, including the Texas freeze earlier this year. You know, just this year, we've had over 36 losses over $1 million. And over the last 10 years, we've had 25 losses over $10 million. And some of those big claims are water damage claims. So that's a lot of money from a burst pipe. I mentioned water damage as being the top loss driver, both for severity, for the cost of losses, and the frequency of losses. But there's also a lot of natural catastrophes you'll see here on this list. Flood, wind, and hail are all top loss drivers for FM Global, for our clients. So these are all areas, again, where we would say to focus and prioritize to reduce the potential for risks. And things you can do, you already do right now, you perform HVAs, but I also suggest you allow, partnership and use resources with your insurance companies and your design and architects, construction, to perform those risk assessments to highlight the areas within their expertise that may be an exposure to your loss. We all know that data is key. Where have your losses been? What are the trends? Are there deferred maintenance that may turn into property losses down the road? Remember that these losses are hitting your organization's retention or deductible first before the insurance company, so it's beneficial to control the losses and not even just depend on insurance. And then I'll talk about the indirect costs later, because there may be more at stake. I think some of these losses that I've been talking about right now are just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide, please. Once you know your individual risk portfolio, now it's time to manage that risk proactively. So think about those top 10 loss drivers I shared. What are your top 10 vulnerabilities? How are you managing those? How can you prioritize based on the expected loss impact to your specific organization? Next slide, please. Here's a photo of a hospital, another flood picture. Where we know a lot of you can't get up and move. You can't leave your community. You may be adjacent to a river, what have you. But there's other things you can do. We have some organizations that we partnership that have had close calls for floods, in the last 10, 20 years. And they've had some short-term solutions in place, like sandbagging or handmade barriers. But they've now realized they need a long-term solution. So they have made that investment in flood doors, barriers, raising exhaust openings, formalizing their emergency response. And then, during the next storm, they'll suffer less damage and they'll be able to continue that patient care. And this is all due to pre-planning. It doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work. We also have another client that has definitely avoided some multi-million-dollar losses. They've realized that their MRI machines are in a basement. They are above the normal water level. They've got some labs with tissue specimens and freezers in the basement, and they've moved those things up. All that proactive loss prevention, because any loss is going to potentially affect a patient's life. So, be aware, do the assessment, and plan for the mitigation. I also talked about water damage being the number one loss driver. The other thing that we've seen with a lot of our healthcare clients lately is just more training, even training the nurses where to shut off water, stop that flow, knowing where the valves are, having cleanup carts, shutting off sprinkler heads. Robin talked about making investments. Randy did too. These losses are hitting the hospital's retention first. And a lot of time there are sublimits within the insurance policy, especially for natural catastrophe exposures. So you want to be sure to focus on those areas, focus on business continuity, being proactive, and managing change. During COVID, we saw an increased introduction of plastics for barriers within hospital settings, or more flammables with hand sanitizer and bulk storage. These are, even changes with negative pressure rooms that changed exposures to fire safety. So just knowing and staying on top of those is an ongoing process, and managing that change is all part of that mitigation effort. Make mitigation part of your risk management culture. And then my third and final suggestion is to really commit to resilience. Our most successful hospital partners and clients are the ones where resilience is a key priority from the top level throughout the organization, where the risk management insurance department is able to inform and influence senior leadership. They tie it to the hospital mission. They get, again, buy-in from senior leadership to plant and facilities operations all the way down the line, so that it is important and it gets done. And, we love to see a deep bench of risk management throughout an organization, so that organizational continuity is important. As I said earlier, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide, please. So as you'll see here, we always talk about the cost of insurance. And again, I said, don't depend on insurance, but your premium, your retention or your deductible. But what's next? Let's look at some of these indirect costs. We talked about life safety being your focus, obviously. What about, admissions and reputation and the effect on staffing and the community around you and even your suppliers? There is really, truly a lot more at stake than just the cost of the loss itself. And that's the bigger reason to invest in resilience. Next slide. So I would challenge you, really consider the total cost of risk to your organization. Get to know your risk, develop the mitigation strategies, and commit to resilience for you and your community. Preparedness and pre-planning will definitely pay off, and it looks better to your insurance carrier. We appreciate the partnerships that we have, and we look forward to more. Next slide, please. And then I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
So I think hopefully you have taken away today that extreme weather events are now becoming the norm. So we need to have more discussions and early on our projects. Let's be proactive instead of reactive. I think a lot of our projects, if we don't talk about it early on in the conceptual estimate, it never makes it in that estimate. If it doesn't make it in the estimate, it's hard to make it into the building. So being very proactive and talk about early is important. And there is a return on investments on resilient hospitals. And hopefully that was explained today. So with that, Monica, do we have some questions?
Yeah, sounds good. A reminder to everybody to type in your questions in the Q&A. We do have one question, which I'll read out loud. So the question reads, have you been able to show clients a return on their resiliency investment? And I think, I'm not sure, I will start with Robin or Randy, whoever wants to take it first.
Well, I'll start and say that partners would say yes, that they believe that there has been a return on their investment in the 0.5% that they invested in Spalding. Just in the nor'easters that have happened in Boston that have flooded adjacent properties and really caused damage along the waterfront of Boston, they have not experienced any of that. So I think they've been tracking that, sort of the avoided cost for future recommendations to management. But it's a hard one. Because a lot of people want to think the disaster is never going to happen. And that, like I said, it's a low probability, but high consequence. So I'll turn it over to Randy or Amy to answer that question as well.
I'll let Amy.
Absolutely. On the insurance side, when we see clients that are making risk improvement efforts and mitigation, especially physical risk improvement, you're definitely going to be a savings on the premium side. Obviously, it's going to help with losses overall. The ultimate goal is to protect you guys and keep you guys up and running, but it'll definitely have a positive impact on your insurance premiums.
Thank you all. I don't see any questions. So reminders, you type your question in the Q&A.
But I'll just add something while we're waiting for another question to that answer, and that is that one of the kind of sleeper consequences of a significant event that NYU experienced, that the hospitals in New Orleans experienced, is that if there's a significant weather event and your hospital has to evacuate, that means, and it takes more than 72 hours to repair it or 96 hours to repair it, and you're dealing with medical professionals who have damaged homes, kids out of school, and no job to go to, and they are highly desirable medical professionals around the world, people leave. They vote with their feet. And it is so difficult to find those medical professionals, to recruit them and retain them, that it is a disaster if you lose a significant proportion of your workforce.
Yeah, so, and that's one of those indirect costs that I was talking about, that you can't put a monetary value on, honestly.
Right, absolutely. But it has actually caused certain communities to never recover.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you look at Homestead, Florida, I think that's the kind of classic example. Amy, you probably know that from FM Global, that like half the people in Homestead worked for the hospital. The hospital went down completely, was like a big loss. And Homestead never recovered because those people just picked up and left. So it's a significant issue. I mean, NYU experienced that with the loss of medical staff when they closed for 2 months. It's just a movie, as partners would say, it's a movie you don't want to be in.
Yeah,
right?
And it's all part of that business continuity planning that I, just really touched on, because that's obviously you guys all know that's an entire, well, more than a day presentation. But yeah, It's all about thinking of what could happen and using these other scenarios as a guide to plan for the worst case scenario and continue to practice that and enhance that and be prepared with that.
Right.
So now we have many questions in the chat, so we'll try to go through them quickly. The first question is, how do we start the conversation about resiliency with our organizations? Who needs to be involved in that conversation?
Well,
Speaking once.
No,
go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say every single person, from design to the end. Risk management, plant operations, insurance, senior leadership, everybody. It has to be a part of the culture. I mean, even through mergers and acquisitions, you're bringing on a new property. What are you getting? What are you inheriting? What are the risks now that you're opening your organization up to? A lot to think about.
Yeah, I think it would start with early on in conceptual estimate that you bring in your risk people and bring in Amy or whoever your underwriter is and talk about what things, a hospital that I worked on, the insurance company wanted us to design the exterior skin to 135-mile-an-hour wind load. If we were able to do that, they were able to give us a deduct off the insurance. So it was a direct correlation to this is a no-brainer. It's going to cost us $100,000, but it's going to say it will pay that back in 10, 12 years by lower premium on the insurance premium. So certainly it just needs to be an early discussion because it's just so tough after you've already baked your budget, your design, and then at the last minute somebody comes up with this topic and there's no money left in the budget to try to squeeze it in.
Thank you. The next question has to do with electrification. This person has heard of filling the fuel tank being a challenge post-disaster. And I think, Randy, you may have alluded that to before. Are there feasible ways to electrify to avoid this? And are these systems, meaning the fuel tank, too vulnerable?
Well, people like NYU built their combination heat and power plants on their, what is that, about the 7th floor of that building. So a plant that creates electricity certainly is going to help you with any grid problems. If you ever read the book, The Grid, it's a very scary book to read about how vulnerable our electrical grid is. So certainly a great opportunity to have more reliable electrical to your hospital with a plant on site that creates electricity.
The next question has to do with using, oh, sorry, Robin. I
was going to say that there absolutely is a real movement now to think about the use of fossil fuels on site at hospitals for just these reasons. If you look at what has happened across the country with refueling, it's not easy. After the World Trade Center disaster, you couldn't get a fuel truck below to refuel Beekman downtown because of security concerns. It's absolutely true that a lot of this disruption impacts the ability to refuel it. And so I think hospitals are looking at things like fuel cells as backup, other things than emergency generators. There's also really interesting studies that suggest that emergency generators don't really perform that well in these emergencies, that the in-use track record is not great. And, CMS, for those of you in hospitals probably know this, that CMS tried to increase the requirement for generator testing because they're just saying, oh, if we tested them more, it would be okay. But a lot of hospitals now have such big generator plants that the emissions from testing are a concern. And if they're not going to be reliable, it's a problem. So I think there is a movement afoot to find more reliable power solutions.
Thank you, Robin. I think this question you may be able to answer. Did you get any pushback from local authorities using gray water for irrigation?
No. What we tried to do was when we suggested that they plumb the toilets separate and use the cisterns to fill the toilets in an emergency if they lost the potable water supply, that was like a deep negotiation. But as long as we kept it to irrigation, there were no issues. And that the irrigation obviously isn't aerosolized, it's drip. So no one's touching the water.
Thank you. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to end this event. We want to thank everyone who attended. We recorded the event and we will share the recording with everyone who signed up for this event. To the panelists, thank you so much for all the efforts that you do, you have done, and you will do to continue building a resilient future. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.